Pontarddulais Comprehensive School, Lesson 2, WJC History, USA Nation of Contrasts. For today's lesson, to start off, just think back to your previous work and think about 3 things you've learned about immigration from the last lesson. You don't need to write these down, but I would like you just to test yourself a little bit. Think of 3 facts that you can remember from the previous lesson. As you can see, the title of today's lesson is Xenophobia, which is a dislike or prejudice to people from foreign countries. So we're going to look now to see how America goes from the open door policy as discussed in our previous lesson to this new idea where there was xenophobia or fear, mistrust of immigrants. What you will be learning today is the friction that was caused between Americans and immigrants. How you'll be doing a highlighting activity of sorts and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of the government legislation that was introduced. And why we're doing this is to understand the impact immigration had on life in America. Task 1 today requires you to read the source that's in front of you and then to write down what can be learned from source A about attitudes towards immigration. To give some context, obviously you've got who the source is attributed to, which is President Calvin Coolidge. He was a Republican speaking to Congress in 1923. Congress is the equivalent of our Houses of Parliament. Hopefully you would have picked up on some of these points that I've highlighted in red here. So you can see that President Calvin Coolidge, when speaking to the American Congress, says that society and the government will fail unless America is kept American. He says that new arrivals should be limited so that they're able to absorb them into the ranks of good citizenship. An interesting phrase which I'll come back to in a second. He again repeats the phrase, America must be kept American. He's convinced that the present economic and social conditions warrant a limitation. So he's saying that because of the economic situation and the social situation in America, that they should limit the amount of immigrants coming in. And a closing sentence, which I think will be quite important as we move through this work, is those who do not want to be partakers of the American spirit ought not to settle in America. So we can learn a few things from this. We learn that the President of the United States believed that immigration should be limited. That in itself is a very useful thing for historians studying immigration and the opposition to immigration, because if the President of the United States at the time felt that immigration was an issue, obviously this is something that he would have a great deal of knowledge about and something that he would potentially want to express to other people and convince the American people that this is what he needs to do. Now, if we think about his audience here, he's speaking to the Congress. The Congress in America would have the power to vote on legislation which would allow him to limit immigration. So he's going to try and persuade Congress that immigration should be limited. Also of note is where he talks about things like that slogan, America must be kept American. That is a slogan he's repeating. So they went into this belief that, there's an American way of life that he wanted to preserve. And he believes that the present economic and social conditions warrant limitation. So his belief is that America's economy is not strong enough maybe to support the number of immigrants coming in. Again, we'll look at that in the future. And social conditions. Now, social conditions are probably more in line with what we're going to look at today when we look at the reasons why people didn't want immigrants coming into America anymore. Despite the fact that the vast majority of Americans living in America at this time could trace their genetics, their parentage, their lineage back to immigrants. They were all the children or children's children of immigrants, unless they were the Native Americans. And as I said, that final statement, those who do not want to be partakers of the American spirit ought not to settle in America. Think in your mind, what is the American spirit? What's the American belief system maybe that he's referring to here? And what would be the different beliefs against it? Now, up until the 1900s, immigration had made the USA a very mixed society. America was referred to as a melting pot of all different nationalities. And the idea was that once you came to America, you were no longer an immigrant from Great Britain or from Germany. You became American. And the first settlers were from Northern Europe, from Britain, Germany, Scandinavia. The descendants tended to hold the best jobs, the most money and political power. You see the acronym WASPs there. That stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So white obviously refers to the skin colour of the immigrants. Anglo-Saxon was Anglo-Saxon was not a religious belief, but Anglo-Saxon was a geographical way of identifying people from Northern Europe, and Protestant was a religious belief, so these were Christians and they were of the Protestant faith, not the Catholic faith, which many Eastern Europeans would have been members of. Now, when we refer to who were the Americans, the remaining population of America is made up of the Native Americans, or the Native American Indians as they've been referred to. These were the nomadic people, so these that travel around America, who had lived on the continent for a long period of time. Their ancestors had been there for centuries. Between 1850 and 1890, as I made reference to in my last lesson, they were forced off their land through this belief of manifest destiny, where these WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, came in and took over the land and filled it with white Americans, promising people cheap land in the West and the Midwest. They provided railroads so that people could start to build, and there's also a gold rush which encouraged more white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to come and find their fortune in America. What this did is it damaged the Native Americans' lifestyle, as the Native Americans didn't believe that land or property could be owned. They felt that it just existed and that as people they were free to use it when they needed to. For example, they would often follow the buffalo trails, where they would hunt the buffalo, but only for what they needed, not exterminating the animal to an extent where a large number of them were killed off. By 1917, the American government had forced the vast majority of Native Americans to live in reservations. These were areas of land that they could live within, but they weren't allowed to follow their traditional nomadic lifestyle. The other group that was in America at this time, not native to America, were the Black Americans, whose ancestors had been brought over from Africa to work as slaves. And by 1920, there were 11 million black people living in America. So these were the other groups that were living in America at this time. And it is quite important as we move to this, we think about American society and the different groups within society, because America was made up of a vast number of different groups. And when we talk about the Americans, it's not as simple as just saying the people who lived in America, as there are a number of different groups within this category. As mentioned, there were other groups that formed the Americans. Southern Eastern Europeans in the late 1800s, 19th century. Most new immigrants came from Russia, Poland and Italy. Many were Jewish and Catholic, so they weren't Protestant. They weren't the old immigrants that had been traditionally in America. These were a new wave of immigrants who had different religious beliefs. There was also the increase of Hispanic people coming in from Central America, Mexico and South America, who mainly spoke Spanish. And there was an increase in people from Asia, Chinese and Japanese in particular, working on things like the railroads that I mentioned. For task 2 now, I would like you to match the appropriate title with the definition given. So, for example, where it says these were the first European settlers from Britain, Germany and Scandinavia. The descendants tended to hold the best jobs, the most money and political power. Can you now draw a line from there to old immigrants? Now, hopefully after a bit of time you've been able to complete this task, and the correct answers are as follows. Hopefully you've all managed to get those correct. If not, take some time now to correct it and familiarise yourself with the terms, so that you've got a clear understanding of the different groups that made up American society in the early 20th century. For task 3, I'd now like you to read the information contained in the sheet below and make a list of the main reasons why people opposed immigration. There are a number of reasons listed within here that you should have put down for your answers. So starting with the fact that when migrants moved to America, they often stayed together within their own countries, and this created a sense of uneasiness by many of the existing people living in America, as they didn't get to know these different people from different countries. So the feeling of distrust and intolerance began to grow. Another reason why people began to oppose the immigrants was that they felt they would take their jobs and work for lower wages. They were also seen for an increase in crime, drunkenness, and prostitution. When America became involved in the Second World War in 1917, there was an increase of hostility towards German immigrants, and they didn't like people coming in from Germany. As previously mentioned, the old immigrants tended to look down on these new immigrants from Eastern Europe and Italy, and as many of the old immigrants thought that the ideal American was a WASP, there were racial reasons, religious reasons, and geographical reasons why people opposed immigration as well. What many have argued is the biggest factor in causing opposition to immigration was that many Americans feared that the immigrants would bring the political beliefs of communism into America. America was founded on the idea of capitalism, where there's a free market, you're able to go out and work, and whatever you earn is your money. Apart from the taxes you pay, you can spend it on what you want. There's very little state or government intervention in business. You're free to run your own businesses, and you can pay people whatever you liked. Now, in Russia, at the turn of the 20th century, there had been a revolution in 1917 where the communists had managed to take control of the country, and America feared the communist belief, because the communist belief is that the workers should get paid for all their work the same as maybe the managers of the company. Everyone should share in the wealth. There should be no rich, there should be no poor. It should be shared amongst the people, and the government controls many aspects of life. So they control, for example, in America, you might have had, in these days, Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Well, within a communist country, you would just have the government-owned drink. There'd be one drink. You wouldn't have a choice of different companies competing in the markets, so that then everybody shares in the wealth. So many Americans fear this. Now, I've simplified these political beliefs quite a bit here. If you want to look further into communism and capitalism, please feel free to expand your knowledge and understanding of that. But just for what you need to know is that America was based on the system of capitalism, where you could come to America, earn a great deal of money if you wanted to. It was your money, apart from taxes you paid. Nobody could take that money off you. You didn't have to share your money. It meant a lot of businessmen got very, very rich. The government didn't interfere very much, and this was completely opposite to the communist beliefs, where it was the belief of a commune, or people working together, sharing the wealth to ensure that there's no rich, no poor. Government controls all aspects of business, so that everything is controlled, who get fair wages. That was the belief. Obviously, if you know anything about Russian history and there's something interesting is worth looking into, that's not necessarily how it worked, but that was the belief, that was the political ideology that existed. For task 4 now, I'd like you to use the information that we've gathered so far, plus carry a bit of your own independent research and create a mind map to summarise the main reason people began to oppose immigration into the USA in the early 20th century. So think about, why do people not want immigrants coming into their country anymore? You should have a good understanding now of why the American people feared immigration and were fearful of immigrants coming into the country, or their beliefs about it. What we need to understand now is, what did the government do to try and limit immigration? So the American government introduced legislation to control the flow of immigrants coming into the country. As we saw at the start of the lesson, the president felt that immigration was becoming a problem. Therefore, his government would introduce acts to try and control this flow of immigrants coming into the country. The US government introduced 4 main acts that we're going to look at now. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about each act, and then I would like you to think about what was the advantage and disadvantage to the American government in terms of limiting immigration, and think about how would this reduce problems in America. The first act passed was the literacy test of 1917. Immigrants had to pass a series of tests to prove they could read and write. Many of the poor immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe, had received no education and were so unable to pass this test and were denied entry. So this act was aimed at limiting the amount of immigrants coming to the country who could not read or write. Now, the advantages to the US government of introducing the literacy test of 1917 is that they would not be able to communicate with communities already in the USA, would not be allowed in. So they need to be able to speak English to be able to be allowed in, so they can communicate with communities already there. Now, one of the disadvantages of this to the American government is that whilst it might stop those from coming in who were unable to read or write, it didn't stop people entering with different political and religious views and the conflict with the communities already there in existence. Now, how would this reduce problems? This would reduce problems as if the immigrants couldn't read and write in English, then they would easily communicate with the communities already in the USA, the existing communities, and they would also be likely to find a job. Therefore, less likely to turn to crime, for example. The next act introduced was the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This act set a limit of 357,000 a year on immigrants as well as quotas. So only 357,000 immigrants allowed in per year, but only 3% of the total population of any foreign group already in the USA in 1910 would be allowed in after 1921. So if there were 100 immigrants from Japan in 1910, only 3 more would be allowed in after 1921 per year. So that's what we mean by a quota. Think about who this would advantage and disadvantage. Which groups do you think were in abundance in America before 1910 and had historically been in America, and which groups might be further disadvantaged by this act? Obvious advantage of this is not many immigrants will to enter the USA, so it wouldn't be as crowded. It would reduce particular groups. So, as I said, there had historically been the old immigrants of Britain, Germany, Northern Europe, and now there'd be a lot more of them already living here, so there'd be a lot, when there's 3% of them, it's a lot more than maybe 3% of the Hispanic groups or the Asian groups that were now coming to America towards the end of the 1900s at the start of the 20th century. However, for the American government, it's still a large number of people coming in. 357,000 a year is still a large number of immigrants coming in their eyes, and therefore that would be a disadvantage. How would it reduce the problem? Well, it sets a limit on the amount of people coming in, so the USA wouldn't get as crowded. It also meant that it wouldn't have loads of immigrants from one particular foreign group, so you wouldn't have an abundance of people coming from a certain country. And obviously this might have been in line with things like the Russian Revolution, because you might have seen a large number of immigrants coming over from Russia at this time, which would change the social dynamics in the American government's eyes. The next act introduced was the National Origins Act 1924. Think back to our start of our lesson, what public opinion might have been at this time, what the government's belief might be at this time, because remember we saw what President Coolidge had said in 1923. A year later this act is passed. So think about the context. It's really important when we're looking at history about the context of things and having that wider historical understanding of what was going on. Now this act reduced the limit of immigrants from 357,000 to 150,000 and cut the quota to 2% based on the population of the USA in 1890. So it reduced the quota by 1% and also made it harder for those who came after 1890, so took 20 years off the previous act. It was deliberately designed to penalise immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who had not started to come to the USA in large numbers until after 1890. The act also banned Asian immigration. The obvious advantage of this act is that it further reduced the amount of Eastern and Southern European immigrants coming into the USA and completely stopped any immigrants coming in from Asia. Disadvantages though, this caused a great deal of offence, and it caused tension and conflict between communities. It caused people to get very upset with the government from these different groups now who might not be allowed to see family members, might not be allowed to come to America that they've been planning to. And also, obviously, it creates tension with Asian countries, which we'll see further on in history how this led to issues around World War II. Again, was a potentially contributing factor. How would it reduce problems for the American government, though? It would stop the USA getting as crowded and also limit the number of foreign groups becoming so large that they start to dominate and change the American way of life, what the American government deemed the American way of life. The final act introduced was the Immigration Act of 1929. This restricted immigration to 150,000 per year. There were to be no Asians at all. Northern and Western Europeans were allocated 85% of places. So this placed an allocation saying that if you're from a North and Western European country, then 85% of the places had to go to them first. This act was very successful for the American government in that it limited the amount of people from Eastern and Southern Europe even more than the National Origins Act did, because now you're saying that there's 85% of the population coming into the country has to have come from Northern or Western European countries, leaving only 15% of the spaces available for other countries. However, it did create even further tension and conflict in the USA. For the American government, it totally now eliminated any immigration from Japan, China and Eastern Europe, which had been the major concern of the American government during this period. I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you in understanding the issue of xenophobia in America, the fear of the immigrants coming in, how the American government responded to this fear, the acts they introduced. Obviously, it gives us an understanding of what society was like in America at this time. And as we move on to our next lesson, it will form the basis of seeing why certain issues arose. Don't forget to submit your work in the assignment drop. Any questions, please just email. Thank you. Bye.